Racist cop attacks elderly black woman, but stops when her Secret Service team arrives. It was a quiet Wednesday afternoon in a bustling suburban area. Officer Daniel Carter, known for his brash demeanor and heavy-handed tactics, patrolled the upscale neighborhood with his rookie partner, Officer Mike Simmons. Carter, a man in his late 40s, prided himself on keeping undesirables out of what he considered his territory. Simmons, on the other hand, was still adjusting to the job, following Carter's lead despite his growing unease with some of the veterans' behavior. As they cruised past a high-end boutique on Maple Street, Carter's eyes locked on an elderly black woman exiting the store. She was dressed simply in a cardigan and slacks, holding a small bag from the boutique. Despite her unassuming appearance, something about her caught Carter's attention. Perhaps it was the confidence in her stride, or maybe it was simply the color of her skin in a predominantly white area. "Look at that," Carter muttered, narrowing his eyes. "What do you think she's doing here?" Simmons glanced at her, unsure how to respond. "Maybe shopping? It's a boutique after all." Carter snorted. "Yeah, or shoplifting. Let's check this out." Before Simmons could protest, Carter pulled the cruiser over, his lights flashing. The woman paused, turning her head slightly, her expression calm and composed. As Carter approached her, he wore his authority like a badge of honor, towering over her small frame. "Ma'am," Carter said, his tone sharp, "what are you doing here?" The woman looked up at him, unflinching. "Shopping," she replied simply, holding up the bag. "Is there a problem, officer?" Her calm demeanor seemed to irritate Carter. He gestured toward her bag. "Mind if I take a look inside?" The woman raised an eyebrow. "Do you have probable cause? Or is this just because I don't fit your idea of someone who should shop here?" Carter's jaw tightened. Simmons, standing a few steps behind, shifted uncomfortably. The woman's question was pointed, and it was clear she wasn't intimidated. Carter decided to press harder. "Let's see some ID," he demanded. With a faint sigh, the woman reached into her purse and handed him her identification. Carter examined it briefly but didn't seem satisfied. "What are you doing in this neighborhood? This isn't exactly a place for someone like you." "Someone like me," she repeated, her voice steady but laced with an edge. "I wasn't aware this area was off limits." Carter's face hardened. "Don't get smart with me. Just answer the question." The woman crossed her arms. "Officer, if you have a legitimate reason to detain me, I'll cooperate. But if this is harassment, you're making a mistake. A big one." Carter chuckled humorlessly. "A mistake, huh? We'll see about that." He gestured for Simmons to stay back and reached for his radio, calling in a code that indicated a potential theft suspect. Simmons frowned but said nothing, his unease growing. The woman watched the exchange, her expression unreadable. As Carter moved closer, he grabbed the bag from her hand and began searching through it without her consent. It contained nothing but a scarf, neatly folded and wrapped in tissue paper. He glanced at her receipt, which confirmed the purchase, but his pride wouldn't let him back down. "Well, you seem to have all your paperwork in order," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. "But I'm not convinced." The woman tilted her head slightly. "What exactly aren't you convinced of, officer?" "That you belong here," Carter replied, his voice low. "You think you're smarter than me, don't you? We'll see how smart you are at the station." Without further warning, Carter grabbed her arm roughly, pulling out his handcuffs. The woman didn't resist but looked him squarely in the eyes. "You're making a mistake," she said quietly, her voice calm but firm. "Bigger than you realize." Her words hung in the air like a challenge, but Carter ignored them. As he tightened the cuffs around her wrists, Simmons stepped forward, his voice hesitant. Officer Carter, are we sure about this?" "She hasn't really." Carter shot him a glare. "Stay in your lane, rookie. You've got a lot to learn." The woman said nothing more as she was led to the squad car, her composure intact. But as she was placed in the back seat, she adjusted her watch, pressing a discreet button on the side. Simmons noticed the subtle movement and furrowed his brow but didn't say anything. As they drove to the station, Carter smirked triumphantly. "Let's see how tough she is once we get her behind bars." The woman remained silent, staring out the window. A faint, enigmatic smile played on her lips, as if she knew something they didn't. And indeed she did. The ride back to the station was tense, though not for the reasons Officer Carter might have assumed. While he sat in the driver's seat smugly confident, his rookie partner, Simmons, was drowning in a storm of unease. He replayed the encounter over and over in his head, finding fewer justifications for Carter's actions each time. In the back seat, the elderly woman sat calmly, her demeanor unshaken. Occasionally, she would glance out the window, as though the passing scenery were of mild interest. To Simmons, her tranquility was unsettling. Most people in her position, falsely accused, handcuffed, and treated poorly, would have shown some sign of distress. But she was unbothered, almost as if she were waiting for something. "So, what's the plan, Carter?" Simmons asked hesitantly. "What exactly are we charging her with?" Carter chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "Obstruction, resisting arrest, maybe trespassing." "Don't worry, rookie. I've got this under control." "Right?" Simmons muttered, unconvinced. He stared at the rearview mirror, catching the woman's gaze. She met his eyes with a knowing look, one that sent a chill down his spine. It was as though she could see straight through him, reading every thought and doubt swirling in his head. The squad car pulled into the station, a modest building that served as the hub of local law enforcement. Carter parked and exited confidently, opening the door to pull the woman out. Simmons followed, still grappling with whether to speak up or remain silent. Inside, a few officers milled about, drinking coffee and discussing mundane cases. The station's buzz of routine activity came to an abrupt halt when Carter entered, escorting the handcuffed woman. Heads turned, and conversations died mid-sentence. Something about the scene commanded attention. Collins called Sergeant Hayes, a seasoned officer with a no-nonsense demeanor. He eyed the situation with suspicion. "What's this?" "Caught her loitering and acting suspicious outside a boutique," Carter replied smoothly. "Had to bring her in for questioning." Hayes's brow furrowed. "Loitering? Isn't that a little thin, Carter?" "She resisted," Carter added quickly, avoiding the sergeant's penetrating stare. The sergeant's eyes flicked to Simmons, who shifted uncomfortably. "Is that right, rookie?" "She resisted." Simmons hesitated, his mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. He felt the woman's gaze on him again, sharp and patient, as if she were daring him to tell the truth. Well, I mean..." "She was uncooperative," Carter interrupted, his tone brooking no argument. "Trust me, Hayes, she's not as innocent as she looks." Hayes didn't look convinced, but he nodded reluctantly. "Fine. Book her, then. Let's see what she has to say." Carter smirked triumphantly and led the woman toward an empty holding cell. Simmons followed, his unease growing with each step. As Carter secured her inside, the woman turned to face him, her expression calm but her eyes sharp. "Do you always handle cases this way, Officer Carter?" she asked softly. Her tone wasn't confrontational, but the question landed like a blow. Carter sneered. "Careful, lady. You're not exactly in a position to lecture me." The woman smiled faintly, leaning against the cell bars. "Oh, I wouldn't dream of it. I just hope you're prepared for the consequences of your actions." "Consequences?" Carter laughed. "You're in my station. You're the one who should be worried." "We'll see," the woman replied cryptically, her voice steady. Simmons watched the exchange, his stomach churning. Something about her words, her tone, even her posture screamed that she wasn't an ordinary person. Yet Carter seemed completely oblivious, too blinded by his own ego to notice. As they walked back to the main area, Simmons leaned in toward Carter. "Are you sure about this? She seems different." "Different how?" Carter snapped, his patience wearing thin. "I don't know," Simmons admitted. "It's just a feeling. Maybe we should double-check her ID, make sure we didn't miss anything." Carter scoffed. "You've got a lot to learn, kid. This is just another perp trying to act tough. We'll let her stew for a while, and she'll crack." But Simmons wasn't so sure. As they rejoined the other officers, the The rookie couldn't shake the sense that something was deeply, fundamentally wrong about the situation. And he wasn't the only one. Back at the holding cell, the woman checked her watch again, her calm demeanor unwavering. The countdown had begun. The holding cell was quiet except for the soft hum of fluorescent lights and the distant chatter of officers in the station. The elderly woman sat on the bench, her back straight, hands resting loosely on her knees. She appeared entirely unbothered, as if she were waiting in a doctor's office rather than a police station cell. Her presence was magnetic. Officers walking past the holding area slowed, stealing curious glances at her. It wasn't just her calmness, it was the unspoken authority she seemed to carry. She didn't look defiant or angry. Instead, she radiated an air of control, as though she knew more about the situation than anyone else. In the bullpen, Officer Simmons couldn't focus. He sat at his desk, repeatedly glancing at the clock, hoping time would somehow fast forward to the end of his shift. The weight of what had happened gnawed at him. Every time he replayed the arrest in his head, it became clearer how unnecessary it had been. Carter, on the other hand, lounged at his desk, sipping coffee and scrolling on his phone like he had just scored a major victory. "Kid," Carter said without looking up, "stop fidgeting. You look like you've seen a ghost." Simmons hesitated, then decided to speak up. "Don't you think we should run her information again? I mean, what if... What if what?" Carter interrupted, smirking. "What if she's someone important? Newsflash, rookie. Important people don't hang around in neighborhoods like that." Simmons opened his mouth to argue but thought better of it. He glanced toward the sergeant's office, wondering if he should raise his concerns with Hayes directly. But what would he even say? That he had a gut feeling? Meanwhile, in the holding cell, the woman quietly observed her surroundings. Her eyes scanned the security cameras, the position of the exits, and even the way the officers moved about the station. She wasn't nervous. She was calculating. Every so often, she checked her watch, her expression betraying nothing but patience. The calm was interrupted by the sound of a phone vibrating on Carter's desk. Carter glanced at the screen and snorted. "Unknown number," he muttered, letting it go to voicemail. Moments later, the phone buzzed again. "Same number. Persistent, huh?" Carter said with a chuckle before answering. "Yeah, this is Officer Carter. Who's this?" Whatever was said on the other end made him sit up straighter. His face shifted from amusement to confusion. "Oh, no, I don't know anyone by that name. What's this about?" The voice on the line grew louder, stern and authoritative. Simmons couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. Carter's smirk faded, replaced by a scowl. "Listen, buddy, I don't care who you think you are. She's in custody, and that's where she's staying until I say otherwise." Carter ended the call abruptly, tossing his phone on the desk. "Some joker pretending to be someone important. Said they're concerned about our guest back there." Simmons didn't respond. His unease deepened. He glanced toward the holding area and saw the woman sitting as calmly as ever, as if she'd been expecting the call. She caught his gaze and offered a faint, knowing smile. Back in the bullpen, Sergeant Hayes emerged from his office, holding a stack of files. His sharp eyes swept across the room, landing on Carter. "Collins, got a minute?" Carter shrugged and followed Hayes into his office, leaving Simmons alone with his swirling thoughts. The rookie tapped his pen nervously against his desk, debating whether to check the woman's ID himself. But before he could make up his mind, the station doors opened, and two sharply dressed men in suits walked in. The atmosphere shifted immediately. The men carried an air of authority, their movements deliberate and focused. Simmons's heart raced as they approached his desk. "Officer," one of them said, his voice cool and professional, "we're here regarding a detainee. An elderly woman brought in earlier today." Simmons stood up, stammering. Yes, sir. She's in holding cell 3. Can I ask who you are?" The man didn't answer directly. Instead, he handed Simmons a badge. Simmons's eyes widened as he read the title. "Department of Homeland Security. Please notify your superior that we're here," the agent said. Simmons nodded quickly, nearly tripping over his chair as he made his way to Hayes's office. Inside, Carter and Hayes were deep in conversation, but Simmons's urgent knock interrupted them. "What is it, Simmons?" Hayes asked, annoyed. "There are, men from Homeland Security here to see the woman we brought in," Simmons stammered. Hayes frowned, exchanging a glance with Carter. "Homeland Security?" "Yeah," Simmons said, his voice cracking slightly. "They're asking about her." Carter scoffed. "Probably just a mistake. She's nobody." But Simmons wasn't so sure. He had seen the way those agents carried themselves. Calm, direct, and unyielding. They weren't there by mistake. As Hayes exited his office to meet the agents, Simmons couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of something much bigger than any of them had anticipated. Sergeant Hayes approached the agents with measured confidence, masking his unease. The two men stood in the center of the station like statues, their presence already dominating the room. The badge clipped to the lapel of one agent glinted under the harsh fluorescent lights. "Homeland Security. What's this about?" Hayes asked, crossing his arms. The taller of the two agents, a man with piercing blue eyes and an air of authority, stepped forward. "We need access to the woman in holding cell 3. Immediately." Hayes glanced at Carter, who had followed him out of the office, wearing his usual smirk. "I don't know what you've heard, but she's under arrest for obstruction. If this is about some mix-up, I'll need to see proper documentation." The agent didn't flinch. "You've already seen our badges. That should suffice." "It doesn't," Carter interjected, his tone dripping with arrogance. "We don't just hand over detainees because someone in a suit says so." The second agent, who had been silent until now, leaned forward slightly, his voice low but firm. "Do you have any idea who she is?" Carter laughed, the sound hollow. "Yeah, she's just another loudmouth who thinks the rules don't apply to her. Trust me, I've seen her type before." For a moment, the room seemed to freeze. Simmons, standing near the desk, felt the tension in the air thicken. The agents exchanged a look. Then the taller one stepped even closer to Carter. "If you value your career," the agent said in a tone colder than ice, "you'll take us to her. Now." The woman in question remained composed, as if the commotion outside was of no concern to her. She sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap. Her eyes, sharp and focused, occasionally flickered toward the security camera in the corner of the room. The quiet was interrupted by the faint sound of raised voices. She glanced toward the heavy steel door but didn't react otherwise. Instead, she adjusted the bracelet on her wrist, a subtle but deliberate movement. If one looked closely, they might have noticed a faint green light blinking from the bracelet's clasp. Back in the main area, Hayes had clearly lost control of the situation. The agent's patience was wearing thin, and the station had grown unusually quiet as officers watched the standoff unfold. Simmons, still at his desk, felt torn between his duty to follow orders and his growing unease about the entire situation. Carter, as always, couldn't resist pushing further. "Listen, you don't get to barge in here and tell us how to do our jobs. She broke the law. If you've got a problem, take it up with." Before he could finish, the door to the station swung open again. This time, it wasn't just two agents entering. A convoy of sleek black SUVs was visible through the glass doors, and more men in suits filed into the station, their expressions grim. The officer manning the front desk stammered, unsure of what to do as the group of federal agents swarmed in. At their head was a woman in her early 40s, her stride purposeful and her gaze cutting through the room like a blade. "Who's in charge here?" she demanded, her voice carrying the weight of authority. Hayes stepped forward, his jaw tightening. "I am Sergeant Hayes. And you are?" She didn't bother with introductions. "I'm here for the detainee in cell 3. You've made a grave mistake, and I suggest you rectify it immediately." Hayes bristled. "With all due respect, we follow protocol here. Unless you have." "You're already out of protocol," she snapped, cutting him off. She handed over a folder with a single sheet of paper. Hayes unfolded it, his eyes scanning the bold lettering at the top. "Classified authorization. Immediate custody release." Hayes's face paled. This doesn't explain. You don't need an explanation, she said sharply. You just need to comply. Meanwhile, in the bullpen, Simmons watched the chaos unfold, his stomach twisting in knots. Carter, however, wasn't backing down. He leaned closer to Hayes, muttering, "This is insane. You're not really going to let them walk out with her, are you?" Hayes hesitated. His pride and authority were on the line, but the sheer number of federal agents now crowding the station was overwhelming. The lead woman crossed her arms, her expression making it clear she wasn't leaving without the detainee. Then, for the first time since the chaos began, the woman in the holding cell moved. The door to her cell opened, and she stepped out, escorted by 2 agents who had slipped past unnoticed. The entire station turned to watch as she walked into the main area, her head held high. Carter sneered. "You've got to be kidding me." She stopped in front of him, her calm demeanor unshaken. "You should have listened," she said softly. "Now it's out of your hands." As she walked toward the convoy outside, the agents forming a protective barrier around her, the room was left in stunned silence. Hayes turned to the lead federal agent, his voice faltering. Who is she?" The agent gave him a hard look. "You'll find out soon enough." And with that, the woman disappeared into the convoy, leaving behind a station full of officers scrambling to make sense of what had just happened. But for Carter, the unease creeping into his chest told him one thing: this was far from over. As the convoy of SUVs disappeared into the distance, the station felt like it had been hit by a tidal wave. Officers stood frozen in their places, exchanging nervous glances. Carter's face was a mixture of disbelief and simmering anger, while Hayes silently replayed the scene over and over in his mind, trying to piece together what had just unfolded. "What the hell was that?" Carter finally blurted, breaking the silence. His voice was laced with indignation, but there was a noticeable edge of uncertainty. Hayes didn't respond immediately. He was still holding the classified document handed to him by the lead agent, his eyes locked on the bold black lettering. Immediate custody release. Below it, the words United States Department of Justice and Top Secret Authorization sent shivers down his spine. Whatever they had just witnessed, it was well above their pay grade. "She's not walking away from this," Carter snarled, pacing back and forth. "I don't care who she knows or how many suits show up. She broke the law, and we're just supposed to let her waltz out of here." Simmons, still seated at his desk, finally found his voice. "Carter, you really think this is about her breaking the law? Did you see the way those agents looked at us? She's someone important. Someone powerful. Powerful, my ass." Carter snapped. "She's just another," he stopped himself, realizing he was treading dangerously close to exposing his own prejudices. Instead, he redirected his anger. "We're cops. We enforce the law. Nobody's above it." Hayes sighed heavily, rubbing his temples. "Carter, I think you need to take a step back and let this go. Whatever this is, it's way bigger than us." Meanwhile, Simmons noticed something strange. His computer pinged with a notification, a report flagging unusual activity linked to the woman's name. He quickly minimized the window, glancing around to ensure no one else had seen it. His curiosity burned, but he knew better than to draw attention to himself. As the other officers began dispersing, grumbling among themselves, Simmons reopened the file. It was encrypted but not inaccessible, marked with government insignias and clearance codes he had never seen before. He hesitated. If this was as classified as it appeared, digging deeper could land him in serious trouble. But the memory of the woman's calm demeanor and the federal agent's abrupt intervention gnawed at him. Against his better judgment, he started typing, his fingers flying across the keyboard as he tried to bypass the restrictions. While Simmons quietly investigated, Carter wasn't about to let the incident slide. He stormed into Hayes's office, slamming the door behind him. "We need to report this to someone higher up," he demanded. Hayes, now seated at his desk, glared at him. "And say what? That we detained someone who turned out to be protected by federal agents? That we ignored every red flag and nearly escalated a situation we didn't understand?" Carter leaned forward, his tone lowering to a near growl. "You're just going to let them walk all over us? Let her humiliate us in front of the whole department?" Hayes stood abruptly, his voice rising. "What I'm going to do is avoid digging us into a deeper hole. This isn't about pride, Carter. This is about survival. You think those agents won't bury us if we push too hard?" The two men stared at each other, the tension thick. Carter, visibly fuming, finally turned and stormed out, slamming the door behind him. Back at his desk, Simmons's efforts bore fruit. He managed to access part of the encrypted file, revealing a series of redacted documents tied to classified government operations. One fragment caught his eye: Operation Vanguard, High-Value Asset Protection. His heart raced as he read further, piecing together the vague implications. The woman wasn't just someone important. She was tied to something monumental. Her presence in their small town wasn't a coincidence. Simmons realized with a sinking feeling that her arrest might have compromised something far larger than any of them could imagine. Before he could process it fully, a pop-up appeared on his screen. Unauthorized access detected. Tracking initiated. His stomach dropped. He quickly closed the file, his hands trembling. If anyone found out what he had just done, it wouldn't end well. But the brief glimpse he'd gotten only deepened the mystery. Who was she? And why did she command such an immediate and overwhelming response? As night fell, the station's usual hum of activity felt eerily subdued. The officers went about their duties, but an unspoken tension lingered. Carter sat alone at his desk, his jaw clenched as he replayed the incident in his mind. Hayes locked himself in his office, trying to formulate a plan to navigate the fallout. And Simmons, still shaken by what he had uncovered, glanced nervously over his shoulder. He couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was already watching them. The woman was gone, but the storm she had brought with her was only just beginning. The station was quieter than usual the next morning, though the tension hung in the air like a storm cloud. Officers spoke in hushed tones, careful not to mention the events of the prior day. Hayes had called for an early morning meeting, but the unease was palpable. As Simmons entered the meeting room, he noticed Carter seated at the far end of the table, his arms crossed and face locked in a defiant scowl. Hayes stood at the head, looking unusually haggard. The department head cleared his throat. "We're not discussing what happened yesterday. The federal agents made it clear that this is out of our hands," Hayes began, his tone firm. "There will be no official report, and I expect everyone to treat this as if it never happened." "Understood." Murmurs of reluctant agreement filled the room, but Carter scoffed audibly. Hayes shot him a warning glare but didn't address him directly. "Instead," he continued, "focus on your patrols and keep your heads down. That's all." As the officers filed out, Carter muttered under his breath, "Keep our heads down? What a joke." Simmons paused but kept walking, sensing trouble brewing. Back at his desk, Simmons wrestled with the implications of what he had uncovered the night before. Every instinct told him to leave it alone, but the fragmented phrase, Operation Vanguard, High-Value Asset Protection, echoed in his mind. He opened his computer cautiously, ensuring no one was watching. The station's internal network was heavily monitored, and he had already triggered one alert. But there was another angle, an encrypted device the woman had been carrying at the time of her arrest. Simmons had seen it briefly before it was confiscated by the federal agents. Using his administrative clearance, he accessed the station's logs and found the device listed under evidence records. The entry read, "Unknown electronic device. Signal recorded at 17:23 hour." His pulse quickened. He didn't know much about high-level encryption, but he knew that if the device had sent a signal, it must have been received somewhere. And whoever received it could still be watching. Meanwhile, Carter was in no mood to let things go. He marched into Hayes's office without knocking, slamming the door behind him. "You think this is over?" Carter growled. "Those suits humiliated us, and you're just going to roll over? What kind of message does that send to the department?" Hayes, seated at his desk, looked up with tired eyes. "The message, Carter, is that we know when to pick our battles. Do you understand how close we came to ending our careers yesterday? We were lucky it didn't escalate further. Lucky. Carter snapped. That woman walked all over us. She made us look like fools. Hayes stood abruptly, his voice rising. No, Carter, you made us look like fools. You escalated that stop. You ignored every warning sign. And now you want to double down? Think carefully about your next move because I won't go down with you. Carter clenched his fists but said nothing. He stormed out, his frustration boiling over into reckless determination. As the day wore on, Simmons's unease grew. He couldn't stop thinking about the device and the signal it had sent. He considered sharing his findings with Hayes but knew it wouldn't go over well, especially after the morning meeting. Instead, he decided to dig deeper, this time using his personal laptop at home. Late that evening, in the dim light of his living room, he accessed the external database where encrypted signals were sometimes logged. Using the timestamp from the evidence log, he searched for recent transmissions. The result was almost immediate. Signal received. Response activated. The file was heavily redacted, but the headers referenced a high-priority federal operation. Simmons leaned back, his heart racing. Whatever had been triggered by that device, it wasn't over. In fact, it was just beginning. At the station, long after most officers had left for the day, an unmarked black car pulled into the parking lot. Two figures stepped out, their movements deliberate. They entered the building without a word, bypassing the front desk entirely. The night shift officer, startled, stood to greet them. "Can I help you?" One of the figures handed him a sealed envelope. "For your chief," they said curtly before disappearing into the shadows. When Hayes opened the envelope the next morning, the message was brief but chilling. Maintain operational silence. You're being watched. The following morning brought a tense atmosphere to the station. The envelope from the unmarked car remained locked in Hayes's desk drawer, but its warning echoed in his mind. Every decision now felt weighted, every move scrutinized by unseen eyes. Carter arrived late, his usual swagger muted by the collective tension in the precinct. Conversations hushed as he passed, his colleagues unsure whether to align with him or distance themselves. Simmons, who had stayed late researching, watched him with a mix of suspicion and pity. In the locker room, Carter approached Ramirez, the rookie officer who had been his reluctant partner during the incident. "You're not seriously buying into all this, are you?" Carter sneered, leaning against a locker. Ramirez hesitated, his discomfort clear. "I don't know, Carter. Something about this feels off. We shouldn't have pushed it that far." Carter's expression hardened. "Listen, rookie, you don't get to play moral high ground here. You backed me up, same as everyone else." Ramirez didn't respond, but the flicker of defiance in his eyes didn't go unnoticed. Simmons, meanwhile, couldn't shake the encrypted signal's significance. He knew diving deeper could risk his job, or worse, but curiosity gnawed at him. He decided to take a calculated risk. In a quiet moment, Simmons approached Hayes. "Chief, we need to talk." Hayes, already weary from the mounting pressure, waved him into his office. "Make it quick." Simmons closed the door. "I've been looking into that device the woman had. It sent a signal, an encrypted one. I traced it, and it activated something on the other end. A response." Hayes stiffened. "You're telling me you ignored my direct orders to drop this?" "Chief, this isn't just about covering ourselves anymore. Whatever that signal triggered, it's still in play. We need to know what we're dealing with," Simmons urged. Hayes leaned back, exhaling sharply. "If what you're saying is true, then we're already in over our heads. But we can't afford any more mistakes. Keep it quiet, Simmons. And don't bring this to anyone else." That night, as the precinct settled into its routine, a new figure arrived. A man in his late 40s, dressed in a sharp suit, his expression unreadable. He strode into the station without hesitation, his presence commanding attention. The desk sergeant hesitated. "Can I help you, sir?" "I'm here for Chief Hayes," the man said simply, flashing an ID badge. The badge read Federal Oversight Division. Hayes was summoned, his unease apparent as he stepped into the lobby. "Chief Hayes," the man greeted, extending a hand. Agent Monroe. We need to talk. In Hayes's office, Monroe wasted no time. I'll get straight to the point, Chief. We're monitoring the aftermath of your officer's actions. The individual you detained isn't just a person of interest. She's critical to an ongoing operation. Hayes swallowed hard. Operation? What kind of operation? Monroe's expression didn't waver. Classified. What matters is this. Your station is now a liability. Keep your officers in line, or we'll have to step in. Hayes leaned forward, desperation creeping into his voice. How much danger are we in? That depends on you, Monroe replied, his tone ice-cold. Consider this your only warning. As Hayes wrestled with Monroe's ominous words, the tension within the station reached a boiling point. Ramirez approached Simmons in the break room, his voice low. I know you've been looking into what happened. I need to know the truth. Simmons hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. Ramirez, this isn't just about us anymore. Whatever we stumbled into, it's way above our pay grade. Ramirez's jaw tightened. I just need to know if we did the right thing. Did we cross a line? Before Simmons could answer, a commotion erupted from the lobby. Carter was shouting, his voice carrying through the station. I don't care who she is. She doesn't get to walk away without consequences. The outburst drew everyone's attention, and Hayes stormed out of his office. Carter, that's enough. Carter turned, his face red with fury. This is a joke, Chief. They're treating us like criminals for doing our job. You're the one who escalated this, Hayes shot back, his voice sharp. And now you're jeopardizing the entire station. Carter's defiance faltered for a moment, but the bitterness in his eyes remained. Later that night, as the station emptied, Simmons received an email from an anonymous sender. The subject line read, "For your eyes only." Against his better judgment, he opened it. The message contained a single phrase, "Watch your back. They're coming." The air in the precinct was electric the next morning, heavy with the weight of unspoken fears and brewing tensions. Hayes, now acutely aware of the stakes, kept glancing toward the door as if expecting another unannounced visit. The station, normally bustling with routine, felt like a powder keg ready to ignite. In his office, Hayes summoned Simmons, Ramirez, and two senior officers he trusted. Closing the door behind them, he set the tone immediately. "We have a situation," Hayes began, his voice firm. "What happened during that arrest has set off a chain reaction that could dismantle this entire precinct if we're not careful." Simmons leaned forward, his face lined with concern. "Chief, with all due respect, we're past the point of careful. We need to know who she is and why every move we make is being watched." Ramirez chimed in hesitantly. "Is there any chance she's connected to something bigger?" "That signal, Agent Monroe's visit. It can't just be a coincidence." Hayes hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "I've been given very little information, but enough to know we're on thin ice. From here on, no one speaks to the media. No one acts without my approval." "Understood." There were murmurs of agreement, but the unease in the room was palpable. Simmons caught Ramirez's eye, silently acknowledging that their questions would have to wait. While Hayes was busy strategizing, Carter was busy stoking his own fire. In the locker room, he gathered a small group of officers, venting his frustrations. "This whole thing is a setup," Carter growled, pacing. "We're being treated like we're the criminals here. She's hiding something, and I'll be damned if I let them make us the scapegoats." One of the officers, a grizzled veteran named Burns, shook his head. "Carter, you need to let this go. It's above our heads now." "Above our heads?" Carter snapped, slamming his fist into a locker. "They're making us look weak. If we don't stand up, they'll keep walking all over us." Burns didn't respond, but his silence spoke volumes. Carter's frustration only grew as he realized his once loyal supporters were beginning to waver. Later that day, an unfamiliar car pulled into the precinct parking lot. A man in his 60s, dressed sharply in a tailored suit, stepped out. His demeanor radiated authority, though his face was weathered with age and experience. The man entered the station, bypassing the front desk with a quiet confidence. "I'm here to see Chief Hayes," he said, his voice steady but commanding. Hayes, summoned to the lobby, froze when he saw the visitor. "Director Hargrave," he said, his voice tinged with both respect and apprehension. "What brings you here?" Hargrave, a former director of the local field office for the FBI, had retired years ago but remained a figure of influence. "You found yourself in quite the predicament, Chief," he said, following Hayes into his office. Once the door was closed, Hargrave wasted no time. "The woman you arrested is no ordinary civilian. You know that much. What you don't know is how deep this goes." Hayes leaned forward, his nerves fraying. "Then tell me, what am I dealing with?" Hargrave's eyes darkened. "She's tied to operations most of your officers couldn't begin to comprehend. Her arrest was a mistake of monumental proportions, and if you don't handle this correctly, it won't just be your precinct on the line. It'll be you." Hayes's stomach dropped. "What do you mean?" Hargrave stood, his presence looming. "Clean up your house, Chief, before they clean it for you." As night fell, Ramirez couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Leaving the precinct after his shift, he noticed a black SUV parked across the street, its windows tinted too dark to see inside. He quickened his pace, his pulse racing. Just as he reached his car, his phone buzzed. The number was unlisted. Hesitant, he answered. "You're asking too many questions, Officer Ramirez," the voice on the other end said. It was distorted, unrecognizable. "If you value your career and your life, you'll stop." Before Ramirez could respond, the call ended. He looked back at the SUV, but it was gone. Inside the precinct, Carter was spiraling. Frustrated by the lack of action and emboldened by his belief that he was in the right, he began searching through files on Hayes's desk. He found the envelope from the mysterious delivery and opened it. The contents were sparse. A single sheet of paper with a series of cryptic numbers and letters. Carter frowned, his mind racing. Whatever this was, it confirmed his suspicion that Hayes was hiding something. Determined to uncover the truth, Carter pocketed the paper and left the station, unaware of the consequences his actions would soon trigger. The precinct grew quieter as the night deepened. Simmons stayed late, poring over his notes and trying to connect the dots. Hayes sat alone in his office, his head in his hands, the weight of Hargrave's warning pressing down on him. Outside, the city seemed to hold its breath, the calm before the storm. Unseen forces were moving, and the players in this unfolding drama were all being drawn toward an inevitable confrontation. The morning brought an eerie stillness to the precinct, as if the city itself knew something was amiss. Hayes arrived early, his mind heavy with Hargrave's warning. He found Ramirez already at his desk, visibly shaken but trying to maintain composure. Hayes motioned Ramirez into his office. "You look like you've seen a ghost," Hayes said, pouring 2 cups of coffee. Ramirez hesitated, glancing at the door to make sure no one was listening. "Last night, I got a call. It wasn't normal. Someone knows I've been questioning things. They warned me to stop." Hayes's jaw tightened. He sipped his coffee, considering his next words carefully. "Ramirez, you need to understand something. This is bigger than you or me. Whatever we're dealing with, it's not just local. You need to keep your head down and trust me to handle this." Ramirez nodded, but the unease in his eyes was clear. The younger officer wasn't sure how much more he could take. Meanwhile, Carter was already stirring trouble. He had spent the night poring over the cryptic document he had stolen from Hayes's office. Though the numbers and letters meant nothing to him, he was convinced it was proof of a cover-up. At roll call, Carter's impatience boiled over. "How much longer are we going to sit on our hands while the media crucifies us?" he barked, his voice echoing through the room. Simmons, ever the voice of reason, shot him a glare. "Stand down, Carter. You're not helping." "No, Simmons," Carter snapped, standing. "What we need is action. Hayes is hiding something, and I'll find out what." The tension in the room was palpable. Hayes entered just as Carter's rant reached its peak, his eyes narrowing. "In my office. Now." Inside the office, Hayes stared Carter down. You're walking a dangerous line. Carter leaned forward, defiant. I'm not the one hiding things, Chief. That woman isn't who she says she is. And you know it. Why won't you tell us the truth? Hayes clenched his fists, his patience wearing thin. You don't have the clearance, Carter. And your attitude is putting this entire department at risk. One more step out of line, and you're done. Carter stormed out, his frustration spilling into the precinct as he muttered loudly about conspiracies and corruption. Ramirez exchanged uneasy glances with Simmons, both aware that Carter's rebellion was spiraling out of control. Down in the holding cells, the woman remained calm, her demeanor unshaken despite the storm raging above her. A junior officer was tasked with delivering her breakfast, but as he approached, her piercing gaze froze him in his tracks. You're afraid, she said, her voice steady. You should be. The officer stammered, unsure of how to respond. I'm just doing my job. Your job, she replied, her tone growing sharp, is to protect and serve, not to enable men like Carter. The officer fled, leaving the tray untouched. The woman leaned back in her chair, a faint smile playing on her lips. Her time was coming, and she knew it. As noon approached, a black SUV with tinted windows pulled up outside the precinct. This time, no one stepped out immediately. The vehicle simply sat there, its presence ominous and unyielding. Inside, Hayes was alerted. He stepped outside cautiously, his hand resting on his belt. The SUV's back door opened, and a man in a sharp suit emerged. His face was unreadable, his movements deliberate. I need to speak with your detainee, the man said, flashing a badge that marked him as a federal agent. Hayes nodded reluctantly. Follow me. In the holding cell, the woman stood as the agent entered. Their exchange was quiet, almost imperceptible to the officers observing through the cameras. At one point, the woman handed the agent a small, nondescript card. He pocketed it without a word. When the agent exited, he approached Hayes. You have until the end of the day to resolve this, he said coldly. After that, it's out of your hands. What does that mean? Hayes demanded. It means you're out of time, Chief. Make the right decision. While Hayes grappled with the agent's warning, Carter took matters into his own hands. Fueled by his paranoia and the belief that he was the only one seeing the truth, he accessed the precinct's internal database and began searching for information on the woman. What he found shocked him, a series of classified files, each more confusing than the last. But before he could dig deeper, the screen went black, and a warning flashed, unauthorized access detected. Carter's heart raced as he realized the gravity of his actions. He had crossed a line, and there was no going back. That evening, another call came to Hayes's desk, this time from an untraceable number. The voice on the other end was calm but firm. You're running out of time. Release her, or the consequences will be on you. Hayes slammed the phone down, his frustration boiling over. The walls were closing in, and the weight of his decisions was becoming unbearable. The precinct was tense, an almost tangible pressure filling the air as Hayes paced his office. The cryptic warnings, the black SUV, the federal agent, none of it made sense. Hayes prided himself on being able to piece together puzzles, but this one had too many missing pieces. Meanwhile, Carter's actions threatened to bring the entire department to the brink. Downstairs, Carter was growing increasingly agitated. After being locked out of the database, he turned to Ramirez. You have to help me, Ramirez, Carter urged, gripping the younger officer by the arm. Hayes is hiding something, and that woman? She's not who she says she is. Ramirez hesitated, the conflict evident in his eyes. Even if you're right, Carter, this isn't the way. You're going to get us all fired. Or worse. Carter leaned in closer, his voice a conspiratorial whisper. If I don't do something, we'll never get the truth. And I'm not going down without answers. As Ramirez watched, Carter slipped a USB drive into a computer in the corner of the bullpen. It was a risky move, but Carter was beyond caution. Whatever was happening, he was determined to expose it, even if it meant blowing everything up in the process. In the holding cell, Hayes stood before the woman, his frustration boiling over. "Who are you?" Hayes demanded, slamming his hand against the metal bars. "What is this really about?" The woman met his gaze, unflinching. "I've already told you everything you need to know. The rest isn't for you to decide." Her cryptic response only enraged Hayes further. "You're playing games with me, and I'm running out of patience." For the first time, the woman's expression softened, almost pitying. "No, Chief. You're running out of time." Outside, the black SUV returned, this time followed by 2 additional vehicles. The doors opened in unison, and a group of individuals stepped out, each dressed in sharp suits. Their movements were coordinated, purposeful, and their presence sent a ripple of unease through the precinct. Simmons, watching from the front desk, immediately alerted Hayes. "You better come out here, Chief. It's getting serious." Hayes stepped outside, squaring his shoulders as the group approached. At their head was the same agent from earlier. "We're not asking any more, Chief," the agent said coldly. "Release her." Hayes clenched his jaw, his frustration mounting. "I need more than your word for that." The agent stepped closer, his voice low but firm. "You don't have the clearance to understand who she is. But if you think this is about protecting her, you're wrong. This is about protecting you." Inside, Carter's unauthorized access bore fruit. On his screen, a file labeled Priority 1, Eyes Only appeared. His hands trembled as he opened it, revealing a series of documents and photos that painted a chilling picture. The woman wasn't just anyone. She was connected to some of the highest levels of government security operations. One name stood out among the chaos: Director Steele, the head of a classified division within the CIA. As Carter read further, the truth began to dawn on him. The woman in the cell wasn't just protected, she was powerful. And by targeting her, they had unknowingly sparked a fire they couldn't control. Meanwhile, Ramirez wrestled with his conscience. He watched as Carter spiraled, his obsession driving him to reckless extremes. Finally, Ramirez made a decision. He approached Hayes' office, knocking hesitantly. "Chief, we need to talk," Ramirez said, his voice barely above a whisper. Hayes motioned for him to enter. "What is it, Ramirez?" Ramirez took a deep breath. "Carter's out of control. He's accessing files he shouldn't, and whatever he's found, it's big. Bigger than all of us." Hayes' face darkened. "What files?" Ramirez hesitated but ultimately told Hayes about the unauthorized database access. Hayes' frustration boiled over. This department is falling apart. As Hayes stormed out to confront Carter, alarms blared throughout the precinct. The federal agents had triggered an override, locking down the building. Officers scrambled, confused and panicked as the lights flickered. In the chaos, the woman remained seated in her cell, calm as ever. Hayes rushed toward the control room, demanding answers. The lead agent appeared on the monitor. "You've had your chance, Chief," the agent said. "This is no longer your jurisdiction." Hayes gritted his teeth. "What are you planning to do?" The agent's expression didn't waver. "What we have to." As the federal agents entered the precinct, they moved with military precision. Carter, still glued to his computer, was forcibly removed from his station, his protests falling on deaf ears. Ramirez watched in stunned silence as the woman was escorted out of her cell, flanked by the agents. "Where are you taking her?" Hayes demanded, following close behind. The lead agent turned, his tone final. "Away from here. And if you're smart, you'll stop asking questions." As the woman was loaded into the SUV, she turned to Hayes one last time, her expression unreadable. "You'll understand soon enough, Chief." The vehicle sped away, leaving the precinct in disarray. Hayes stood in the parking lot, the weight of the day pressing down on him. Whatever was happening, it wasn't over, and he knew the storm had only just begun. The precinct buzzed with tension after the federal agent's departure. Hayes stood in his office, his hands gripping the edge of his desk. The unanswered questions swirled in his mind like a storm. Who was this woman? Why was she so important? And why did it feel like the department had just become the center of a much larger game? The video of the arrest, leaked to social media by a bystander, had reached the hands of reporters. Within hours, major news networks began running the story. The headlines were damning: racial profiling or justice? High-ranking federal operative detained by local police, and who is the mystery woman? Hayes watched the news coverage on a muted TV in his office, each segment adding fuel to the fire. Reporters swarmed the front steps of the precinct, demanding answers. Ramirez, overwhelmed, tried to shoo them away, but their numbers only grew. Inside, Carter's reckless behavior came to light. Hayes summoned Ramirez and Carter to his office, his frustration boiling over. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" Hayes barked, glaring at Carter. "Your unauthorized access set off alarms in federal systems. They're breathing down my neck because of you." Carter, defiant, leaned forward. "I did what I had to do, Chief. That woman is hiding something, and if you weren't so scared, you'd see it too." "Scared?" Hayes's voice was ice-cold. "You've jeopardized this entire department with your paranoia. Whatever secrets she's hiding, they're far above our pay grade." Ramirez, sitting silently, glanced between the two men. He felt the weight of the situation. Hayes was right. Carter had overstepped, but Ramirez couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was unfolding. As the argument escalated, Hayes's phone buzzed on his desk. It was the mayor. Hayes hesitated before answering, already bracing himself for the storm. "Chief Hayes," the mayor's voice boomed through the phone. "What the hell is going on down there? Do you have any idea the kind of trouble this is bringing to my administration?" Hayes pinched the bridge of his nose. "We didn't know who she was, Mayor. It wasn't supposed to go this far." "Well, it has," the mayor snapped. "The media's tearing us apart, and now I've got federal agents calling me, warning me to keep my nose out of it. Whatever this is, fix it. Now." The line went dead. Hayes tossed the phone onto his desk, the frustration evident on his face. The weight of the city, the department, and his own pride pressed heavily on his shoulders. As the precinct spiraled into chaos, Ramirez received a message on his personal phone. It was an encrypted email, sent from an anonymous source. The subject line read, "You're asking the wrong questions." Ramirez's heart raced as he opened the email. It contained a single sentence. "Look at what's missing, not what's in front of you." Attached was a photograph of a document. It appeared to be an intelligence report, heavily redacted, but one word stood out: Operation Blackbird. Ramirez, unsure of what he was seeing, approached Hayes in private. "Chief, I think you need to see this." Hayes stared at the screen, his brow furrowing. "Where did you get this?" "It came to my phone," Ramirez admitted. "I don't know who sent it, but what's Operation Blackbird?" Hayes's expression darkened. "I don't know, but I'll find out." They both knew that whatever Operation Blackbird was, it had something to do with the woman they had detained, and the fallout they were now facing. Meanwhile, Carter began to rally support among a small group of officers in the precinct. "Hayes is too soft," he argued in hushed tones. "We can't let these federal suits push us around. We deserve answers." His words resonated with a few, but others distanced themselves, unwilling to jeopardize their careers further. The precinct was beginning to fracture, the pressure splitting loyalties and trust. That evening, Hayes received a call from the lead federal agent who had taken the woman. His tone was grave. "You're in over your head, Chief. Whatever you think you know, forget it." Hayes's frustration boiled over. "You think you can waltz into my precinct, take a detainee, and not explain anything? My officers are asking questions. The media's breathing down my neck. What do you expect me to do?" "Stay out of it," the agent said bluntly. "This isn't about your precinct anymore. It's about national security. And if you keep digging, you'll regret it." The line went dead, leaving Hayes staring at the receiver, anger and curiosity warring within him. Late that night, Ramirez stayed in the precinct, poring over the email and its cryptic contents. The mention of Operation Blackbird gnawed at him, but there was little he could do without drawing suspicion. As he was about to leave, he noticed something on his desk, a manila envelope, unmarked and sealed. Inside was a single photograph, the woman they had detained, standing in front of what appeared to be a secure government building. But it wasn't just her presence that caught his attention. It was the caption on the photo. Classified, Deputy Director Steele. Ramirez's blood ran cold. They hadn't just arrested anyone. They had arrested someone who could destroy them all. Ramirez sat frozen at his desk, staring at the photograph. The words, Deputy Director Steele, were etched into his mind, reverberating with an intensity he couldn't shake. She wasn't just a federal agent. She was one of the highest-ranking officials in national intelligence. The realization hit like a freight train. They had detained someone who could dismantle their careers, their precinct, and potentially their lives. He hesitated for a moment, then picked up the envelope and walked briskly to Chief Hayes' office. When he entered, Hayes was leaning over his desk, visibly exhausted, papers and news reports scattered everywhere. Without a word, Ramirez placed the photo on the desk. Hayes' eyes narrowed as he examined it. Then they widened, disbelief and dread overtaking his features. "Where did you get this?" he demanded, his voice barely above a whisper. "It was left on my desk," Ramirez replied. "No name, no explanation. Chief, we've made a mistake bigger than any of us could have imagined." Hayes rubbed his temples. This is a disaster. We have to figure out how to contain this before it's too late." Meanwhile, Carter's growing faction of officers was becoming more vocal. They gathered in the precinct's locker room, feeding each other's paranoia. "The chief's gone soft," Carter said, pacing the room. "He's letting some bureaucrats walk all over us. We did our job, and now we're the bad guys." "But what if this woman is really someone powerful?" one officer hesitated. "The feds wouldn't show up for just anyone." Carter scoffed. "Powerful or not, she's not above the law. And if the chief won't do anything, maybe it's time we handled this ourselves." The room was split, some nodding in agreement, others growing increasingly uneasy. The once cohesive team was now fractured, loyalty eroding under the strain of conflicting ideologies. Late that night, Hayes arranged a clandestine meeting with an old contact, a retired intelligence officer named Langley. They met in a dimly lit diner on the outskirts of town, away from prying eyes. Hayes slid the photograph across the table. "What do you know about her?" Langley's face hardened as he looked at the photo. "Deputy Director Steele," he said, his voice low. "She's a legend in the intelligence world. Operative for over 2 decades, orchestrated some of the most critical counterterrorism operations we've ever had. If she's here, it's for a reason." "What reason?" Hayes pressed. Langley leaned back, his expression cautious. "You don't want to know, and trust me, you don't want to get involved. Whatever she's here for, it's classified for a reason. My advice? Distance yourself from this. Now." Hayes shook his head. "It's not that simple. My officers are divided, the media's camped outside, and now this photo shows up out of nowhere. I can't just let this blow over." Langley sighed. "Then tread carefully, Chief. People like Steele don't play games, and if she decides you're a liability, you won't see it coming." Unbeknownst to the precinct, Steele, now safely back in federal custody, was already making her next move. Sitting in a high-security office, she reviewed surveillance footage and documents related to the arrest. Her calm demeanor masked a steely resolve. An aide approached her. "Ma'am, should we proceed with the debrief?" Steele nodded. "Not yet. Let them stew a little longer. Sometimes, the best lessons are learned under pressure." "Do you want us to suppress the media coverage?" the aide asked. "No," Steele said firmly. "Let it run its course. They need to understand the gravity of their actions, and the public needs to see the cracks in the system. It's the only way we'll get meaningful change." As tensions reached a boiling point in the precinct, an unexpected visitor arrived. A man in a dark suit, carrying a briefcase, walked into the building. He moved with purpose, ignoring the curious stares from officers. "I'm here to see Chief Hayes," he announced, his voice calm but commanding. "It's regarding Steele." Hayes, already overwhelmed, reluctantly met with the man in his office. The visitor introduced himself as Agent Morris, a senior operative within Steele's division. "We're giving you one chance to cooperate," Morris began. "You have no idea what you've stumbled into, and I suggest you stop trying to piece it together." Hayes bristled. "You can't just walk in here and—" Morris interrupted, his tone icy. "Let me be clear, Chief. This isn't a negotiation. Deputy Director Steele has extended more patience than most would in her position. But that patience has limits." Hayes stared at him, the weight of the situation finally sinking in. "What do you want from me?" "For now, nothing. But if I were you, I'd start preparing your officers for what's coming next. Steele isn't finished, and neither are we." That night, as Hayes tried to piece together his next move, Ramirez received another anonymous email. This time, it was a video file. Hesitant but curious, he opened it. The footage showed Steele, speaking directly to the camera. Her message was clear and chilling. "To those who think they're in control, think again. Your actions have consequences, and I always ensure they're felt. This isn't over." The precinct was eerily quiet the next morning. Officers avoided eye contact as they shuffled through the halls. Ramirez hadn't slept, the video of Steele's cryptic warning replaying in his mind. He debated telling Chief Hayes but hesitated, unsure of how the information would be received. Collins, meanwhile, was as combative as ever. He stormed into the station, slamming his badge on the front desk. "This circus ends today," he barked, his voice echoing through the building. "I'm tired of walking on eggshells because some bureaucrat thinks she's untouchable." Hayes emerged from his office, weary but resolute. "Collins, my office. Now." The room grew tense as Collins marched past, glaring at his fellow officers. In Hayes's office, the confrontation was immediate. "You've put this entire precinct at risk," Hayes began, his voice low but sharp. "Do you understand who you've arrested? What you've set in motion?" Collins crossed his arms. "She's just another criminal trying to pull rank. I don't care who she is." Hayes leaned forward, his eyes blazing. "She's Deputy Director Steele of the CIA. Her reach goes beyond this precinct, beyond this state. If you don't start taking this seriously, you're not just risking your job, you're risking everything." Before Collins could respond, the door to Hayes's office flew open. A group of federal agents, dressed in sharp suits and flanked by 2 uniformed officers, entered the station. Their leader, Agent Morris, wasted no time. "We're here for Deputy Director Steele's case file," Morris announced, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. Collins stepped forward. "You don't get to walk in here and demand." Morris cut him off. "This isn't a request. This is a federal matter now. Any further obstruction will be met with consequences you're not prepared to face." Hayes nodded reluctantly. "Ramirez, bring them the file." Collins seethed as Ramirez hurried to comply. "You're just going to let them take over? This is our jurisdiction." "No," Hayes said firmly. "It stopped being our jurisdiction the moment Steele walked through those doors." Collins wasn't ready to back down. That evening, he met with a small group of officers in a secluded parking lot. Among them were his most loyal supporters, officers who shared his resentment of the growing federal presence. "This isn't about her," Collins argued. "It's about us, about protecting the integrity of our force. If we let them steamroll us now, we'll never recover." One officer hesitated. "But what if she really is who they say she is? We could be making this worse." Collins dismissed the concern. "I don't care who she is. She doesn't get to come into our house and call the shots." The group murmured in agreement, though unease lingered in their expressions. Collins didn't notice, or didn't care. His determination to regain control blinded him to the larger picture. In a secure government facility miles away, Steele reviewed the developments with her inner circle. Agent Morris stood at her side, updating her on the situation. "They're fractured," Morris reported. "Collins is rallying a small faction, but the rest of the precinct is starting to fall in line." Steele nodded, her expression unreadable. "Good. Let them implode on their own. Collins's arrogance will be his undoing." "What's our next step?" Morris asked. Steele leaned back, her gaze steely. We push harder. Release a statement to the media. The public needs to see the cracks in their system and prepare the next phase. Morris hesitated. You're sure about this? It might escalate things. Steele's lips curled into a faint smile. It's time they learned what real accountability looks like. That night, a bombshell report aired on national television. The anchor revealed Collins's history of misconduct, including multiple complaints of excessive force and racial profiling. The news sent shockwaves through the community, sparking protests outside the precinct. Inside, the atmosphere was chaotic. Officers scrambled to handle the influx of media inquiries, while Collins retreated to his office, furious and paranoid. Ramirez, watching the news from his desk, felt a mix of vindication and dread. The walls were closing in, and he knew things were about to get worse. As the protests outside grew louder, Collins received an anonymous text message. It read, "You think you're in control, but your time is running out. Watch your back." He looked around the station, his paranoia reaching a fever pitch. Meanwhile, Steele, sitting calmly in her office, prepared for the final phase of her plan. The precinct was in chaos. Protesters chanted outside, their voices echoing through the walls. Inside, officers were divided, some blaming Collins for the mess while others tried to maintain a facade of unity. The media coverage had turned brutal, exposing not just Collins's history but the systemic issues within the precinct. The tension was palpable, and every officer felt the weight of the unfolding crisis. Collins, pacing in his office, was a man unraveling. The anonymous text haunted him, and the media storm only worsened his paranoia. His phone buzzed incessantly with calls from reporters and messages from allies, but none brought him solace. He slammed his fist on the desk, his anger boiling over. "This is a witch hunt," he shouted, though no one was around to hear him. Ramirez, watching from a distance, couldn't shake his unease. The division in the precinct had reached a boiling point, and he knew Collins was capable of something drastic. Yet, Ramirez also felt a flicker of hope that Steele's calm and calculated demeanor would lead to justice. Deputy Director Steele, meanwhile, was operating with precision. She had spent the past few hours coordinating with her team and key government officials. The protests outside the precinct, while organic, had been amplified by her strategic leaks to the press. Steele wasn't one to leave things to chance. She arrived at the precinct unannounced, flanked by federal agents. The room fell silent as she walked through, her presence commanding respect and unease in equal measure. Hayes approached her, his face tense but resigned. "Deputy Director Steele," he began, his tone cautious, "I trust there's a way to resolve this without further escalation." Steele regarded him coolly. "That depends on your officers, Chief. My priority is accountability, not escalation. But let me be clear, this ends today." Collins emerged from his office, his face red with anger as he saw Steele standing in the precinct. "You think you can just waltz in here and take over? This is my station." Steele didn't flinch. Her voice was calm but firm. "Officer Collins, your actions have endangered not only your career but the integrity of this department. You've been given ample opportunity to cooperate, yet you've chosen defiance. This is your last chance." Collins sneered. "I'm not scared of you or your threats. You're just here to play politics." Steele stepped closer, her eyes locking with his. "This isn't politics. This is justice. You've abused your position, violated the trust of the public, and undermined the very principles you swore to uphold. And now, you'll face the consequences." At that moment, Agent Morris handed Hayes a sealed envelope. "Chief Hayes, this is a federal warrant for Officer Collins's immediate suspension and detainment pending investigation." The room erupted into murmurs as Collins's face turned pale. "You can't do this," he shouted, but his protests were cut short as federal agents stepped forward. In a poetic twist, Collins found himself in handcuffs, his bravado replaced by panic. Officers who had once followed his lead looked away, unwilling to meet his gaze. Ramirez stood frozen, his conflicting emotions written all over his face. As Collins was escorted out of the precinct, protesters outside erupted in cheers. The image of him being led away in handcuffs quickly went viral, symbolizing a turning point in the fight for accountability. Later that evening, Ramirez approached Steele, his voice hesitant. "Deputy Director Steele, I want to apologize for not stepping up sooner. I knew something was wrong, but I didn't do enough to stop it." Steele regarded him thoughtfully. "Acknowledging your failure is the first step, Officer Ramirez. But the real question is, what will you do now?" Ramirez nodded, determination replacing his guilt. "I'll do better. I'll speak up. I'll make sure this doesn't happen again." Steele offered a small nod. "Then perhaps some good can come out of this after all." The fallout from the incident was swift and far-reaching. Collins's actions sparked a national conversation about police accountability and systemic racism. Steele's calm yet firm handling of the situation made her a national figure, celebrated for her resilience and leadership. The protests led to tangible change, with new policies implemented to ensure greater oversight and transparency within law enforcement. Ramirez, inspired by Steele's example, became an advocate for reform, using his experience to educate others on the importance of integrity in policing. That night, Steele sat alone in her office, the weight of the day settling over her. She had achieved what she set out to do, but the victory felt bittersweet. The system she had fought to hold accountable still had a long way to go. As she gazed out the window, her phone buzzed with a message from Agent Morris. "Collins is in custody." The operation was a success. Steele allowed herself a moment of satisfaction. The fight wasn't over, but for today, justice had been served. I ask you to please comment on your impressions and opinions in the comments. I would feel very happy if you leave me a like.